Hi, I'm Brandon. This is the first episode of an in-depth tutorial of Cubase 12. I have a free gift for you. It is a Cubase 12 Shortcuts PDF that I made. It is a one-page document filled with only the shortcuts that I use on a daily basis. So it is great value. It's free. Just click the link in the description. It'll help you a lot in your journey. After watching this video, you will understand how to set up your hardware, have your audio interface and MIDI keyboard connected to Cubase with the right driver, know how to deal with latency when recording and pops when playing back your music. Let's get started with hardware. This image represents a simple stereo input and output setup that you might see in a home recording studio. You have four basic sections plus an extra MIDI section that I did not image here. Essentially, you'll have inputs like guitar, keyboard, mics for recording anything like vocals or drums, coming into the input of an audio interface. The audio interface, this is just one example. There are lots of different brands and types, but essentially its job is to take audio analog information, analog sound, and allow a computer to understand it. So it converts analog to digital. So you'll input these analog sound sources with either a 1/4" TS cable, which we'll talk about in a second, or an XLR cable. Your audio interface is connected to the computer with normally a USB cable, but we'll also talk about some of the other options in a moment. And then after it's done talking, the computer sends back information and plays it out through speakers or headphones. Speakers are connected normally through XLR, but sometimes a mix. And then normally the headphones are connected with a 1/4" TRS, which we'll talk about in a second, or sometimes a 3.5 millimeter connector, which I'll show in a second. Just one more thing to mention, sometimes speakers are not powered and they require a power amp, but that is per brand and model, so that's something you can look up based on which speaker you're looking into buying or that you own. Okay, let's talk about cables for a second. These are certainly not every cable type. These are just the most common that you'll see in audio recording. 1/4" TRS is what you're going to use for your headphones. Tip ring sleeve is what TRS stands for. It's different than the 1/4" TS, which is just tip sleeve. Tip sleeve is used for stuff like guitars and keyboards, perhaps. So the way you can see that is there's going to be two lines on this: tip, ring, sleeve. And then just on this, we'll just have a tip, sleeve. There's just the one line. Then you got your 3.5 millimeter jack, which is this little guy. So this is like your standard headphone plug. It's the most common. You can have an adapter to the 1/4", and depending on which audio interface, you could use either or. Mine happens to have both. This is an XLR cable. It is used for connecting mics and sometimes other things, but mostly you're going to use this to connect a mic to your audio interface, and perhaps your speakers to your audio interface. Your audio interface will most likely connect with a USB cable, and this is one iteration. This is USB-A, but there's also B and C. Other common cables you might see is Thunderbolt, Firewire, or PCIe. Your audio interface will come with the cable, and you should be able to plug it into your computer no problem. So in Cubase for this lesson, we'll be looking at the audio and MIDI connections and setup. So you're not going to be recording anything yet, but this will allow us to be able to record. I recommend going to More and choosing Empty and clicking Create and saving your project wherever you'd like to save it. Something that I like to immediately do after opening a project is to save it. When you're opening a project, you're just choosing where you want it to be, but you actually haven't told the program to save yet. So it's a good idea to go in there and click Save or Save As and save your file. Give it a name. And click Save. Go ahead and click Studio and Studio Setup. We are going to talk about audio system and the device. We're also going to talk about MIDI port setup. The rest we'll save for another time. So it can look a little bit overwhelming when you first see all of this information. We'll go over some of it. We're not going to touch on everything because there's a good portion of this that you never really want to adjust unless you for sure know what you're doing. So I'm not going to try and explain all of that right now. Let's just get your system up and running. First thing you want to do is make sure you're using an ASIO driver if you're in Windows. If you're in Mac, it's not going to be ASIO. But you can click on this panel, make sure you're in audio system, click on the driver, and choose what your audio interface is. You may have needed to install a specific driver from the vendor's website. For example, if you have Focusrite, you might want to go to the Focusrite website, go to their driver page and type in whatever model you have and download that driver. I happen to have an RME Babyface Pro. So I did that for their website, and it actually gave me a cool little software of its own to help me utilize and set levels and route stuff. So you don't need to worry about this. I just wanted to show you what some stuff could look like. So once you have that driver installed, go ahead and choose it, and then you're good. We'll talk about latency in a minute when we go onto the actual device. And I wouldn't change any of these. Let's see. Yeah, the only other thing you need to know on this page is this reset button can be useful if you're having audio issues. Maybe you open the program and you're not hearing anything when you try and play your instruments, or maybe there's some other audio issue. You can just go into this panel, click Reset, and it just kind of restarts the connection with your audio interface, and that might solve some issues sometimes. Okay, so let's go ahead and click this device. So this is the audio interface. This is all the channels that it comes with. You don't really need to worry about these this ports thing unless you wanted to rename your channel. So for example, if you knew that in your first channel of your audio interface you always wanted that to be a vocal mic, you could say vocal mic, and then later on when you're adding tracks, instead of saying analog 1, you would see vocal mic. So you could do that if you wanted to. I myself don't want to do that, so I just reset it to the standard default port names. This reset also does the same thing, I think, as this button. Resets the device. Yep. And you can see that as I hovered over that, it is showing that clearly. One thing that you're going to want to know for sure is latency and buffer size. So if you click Control Panel on Windows, and then on Mac it's a different name, but it's going to be in the same spot. control panel. This will look different depending on what device you have, what audio interface you have, but you should have an option to change the buffer size. There's a lot of numbers here. I'm going to give you a rule of thumb on this. The smaller you have your audio samples, the less latency you will have, which is a good thing. Latency when recording, the higher the number of latency, the harder it is to record in time, essentially. So if you have a low number, then you have less latency, input and output. So you would think, well, why wouldn't I just have the lowest number? Why wouldn't you just put 48? No one wants latency, right? Well, the lower the number, the harder it is on your computer. Your CPU can only handle so much. And if you're doing things, especially later on, if you're mixing, you might want to raise it because the more plugins you have, reverb, EQ, delay, dynamic stuff, limiters, compressors, all of that. The more you have of that, especially reverb and delay, the harder it is going to be on your system. And that's where pops and other sort of issues and artifacts can come into play. So you kind of want to find a balance. I like to record on anywhere from 128 to maybe 512. And then I like to mix on 512 to 1000. I rarely go up to that 2048, but you could if you wanted to. And this is also going to depend on how strong your computer is, how many cores it has, how fast it is, that sort of thing. So I like to leave mine kind of just on 256 as kind of a middle ground. And then later, if I'm mixing and I need to, I can raise it. But let me show you what happens. So if you go to 1000 and you click OK, this didn't update immediately. So if I reset it, it shows what. So you might want to. That brings up something important. Changing buffer size can be temperamental. At least it is on my audio interface. I always have to reset the device once I change the buffer size, and sometimes that's not even enough, and I have to go to my hardware, the actual box on my desk, and turn that on and off, the audio interface. So you have more processing power with a higher number, but you would have a harder time recording in time. As you can see, the input latency has increased. If you hear pops or artifacts or weird things in your sound that shouldn't be there, it's probably because you're too low. Like you're down here and you've started to add reverb and whatnot, so you might want to increase that for mixing. Okay, last thing, let's talk about MIDI. So MIDI is kind of the same thing with your audio interface. You might need to install a specific driver for the keyboard that you bought. And MIDI isn't always just a keyboard. It can be many different types of inputs, like pads or knobs or faders or what have you. So you might need to go to the specific vendor's website and download the driver for your product. Once you have that downloaded, you should just be good to go. This is showing all of the MIDI devices that I have. The one that I use, well, I use quite a bit of them, but you can see, for example, this Code 49 is my keyboard. And it's got an in and an out. You're probably not going to be using the MIDI out function unless you're sending out MIDI information to like an old school synthesizer that would then come back in a different input. So mostly I would just make sure that you're active and you're all in, and you should be good to go. For a little bit of fun, I have a game for you guys. Can you guess the instrument that this sound belongs to? I have cut off the beginning and the end of the note so there's no attack or release, and I've faded in so it's just the sound. Type your guess of what instrument this is in the comment section. I'm offering one-on-one help right now. If you decide you need that, the link is in the description. Thank you for watching, and in the next video we'll be exploring audio connections.